thank you all for being here. It's exciting to be here, and I've been a fan of these two for a long time, so it's nice to be on stage with them. And I wore my feminist merch shirt and contemplated if I could actually put on like all of my pins and jean jacket and bring all my shirts here, since we're talking about consumerism and feminism today. So I'm getting into it, and I'm glad that I'm actually moderating this because I have a lot of mixed feelings on it. But I want to start with the word feminist. So it actually took me years into my early 20s before I actively embraced the word feminist and started using it, called myself a feminist. And at that time, I'm now 35, so this was about a decade ago, a lot of very smart, very educated, very active female friends totally rejected the word. They didn't want to use it. They would ask me if I was man-hating, if I had stopped shaving my armpits, like all of the stereotypes you hear about the word feminist. And so it is nice now to see the way that the word is being embraced. But how do you define the word feminist? And then has that changed over time in the way that you think about it?
You know, it's interesting. So I'm on the board of the Ms. Foundation, and at Ms. we launched the campaign, and it was called My Feminism Is. And it really was encouraging folks to go on YouTube and just let us know what is feminism to you. You know, at its basic core, it just means that you believe in the equality of all people regardless of gender. You know, and usually if you share that with someone, they say like, oh, well, I guess I'm for that. Like, how could you not be for that, right? So I think it's always just meant this very, you know, very basic thing around gender equity, but it becomes just like anything else, what people make of it. And so I think we're living in a really fascinating time. Just as you shared, I, you know, have a very similar experience of that word in my own lifetime has kind of been fashionable, unfashionable, fashionable, unfashionable. You know, it was very exciting to see Beyonce standing on stage in front of, you know, huge feminist words, and suddenly everybody was a feminist and felt very cool and exciting. Then this country elected probably the opposite, so that's interesting, right, coming up at the same time. So I think it definitely morphs and changes.
Thank you. So I actually have always embraced the word feminist, actually maybe because people really were uncomfortable with it. What always struck me as funny about the word was that in its structure, it sounds like something very negative. You're a racist, you're a classist, you're a feminist, which is very problematic conceptually, because you have this idea in your head and it's something positive and it's something that you believe is important, but in its linguistic structure, it's a sort of, it confronts people, right? But I agree with everything that both of you just said, but to me there's something very specific about my feminism, and it is that it challenges institutions to change. One of the issues I think we've had in the past 20 or 30 years is this idea that feminism is whatever people say it is, or whatever it is for themselves, which is kind of a nice idea, but it actually isn't a political idea. And to me, when we say we can envision a feminist world, it's kind of a radical, active imagination, because nobody really takes time to step back and think about how universally and pervasively male-centered the world is without us giving that a name. So men's experiences end up being the experiences that are considered human, and the experiences of people who aren't, and I'm using these words as gigantic bucket words, but essentially the experiences of men who aren't in this country, straight, white, elite, don't count as fundamentally central. So to me, feminism has to be, it has to involve that confrontation of institutions so that they themselves change as opposed to just individual people trying to work their ways around them.
Which is so interesting because now you see this word everywhere, and I think it begs the question, like, can anyone who calls themselves a feminist be a feminist? Like, is Ivanka Trump a feminist because she says she is, or do you have to actually do something? Like,
Right.
is there, I think what you're saying is there's a political action that comes along with it. And I find that to be complicated now.
Very complicated.
Heather, I was reading a piece about you this morning in the Huffington Post that talked about how in 2005, you in fact staged a girl caught on Abercrombie and Fitch. And you and a large group of teen girls were actually invited by the company to come in and have a conversation. They had put out, I mean, Abercrombie has like never been very good on gender issues or class or race issues, but in this specific instance, they had put out a line of t-shirts that featured like basically skinny blonde white girls saying, "Do I make you feel fat?" And so you staged this girl caught, and you were invited in, and what the article said, and you can elaborate a bit, is that, you know, it was all these dudes in their flip-flops and their Abercrombie t-shirts, basically being like, all right, we'll let you have your 5 minutes to explain what you think we should do, and your team pitched the idea of doing empowering attire for girls. And this was in 2005, and basically they...
Just so ahead of our time.
Right, exactly. They ignored you. And so I want to hear about that, but also now we're in this era where, like, literally you cannot walk into a store, like Forever 21, Abercrombie, like wherever you go, it's like rah, rah, girl power. So what does it feel like to have seen that shift?
You know, it's so interesting because... So we staged this girl caught. There were 24 teenagers in Pittsburgh, and as you shared, you know, the T-shirts said things like that. They also said, "Who needs brains if you have these?" across the front. They said stuff like, "Last night I had a nightmare I was a brunette." Right. So if you think of any ethnic group who maybe aren't naturally not brunette, right? It's basically a racist T-shirt pretending it's not a racist T-shirt. So we staged this girl cut, and we had these demands. And one of the demands was not just that they pull the T-shirts, but that they actually invite us into their boardroom and have a meeting and hear what the girls had to say. And then in that meeting, as you shared, the girls came up with their own T-shirts, and some of them were like, "Your future boss," you know, and sort of tried to stay in that like Abercrombie, right, kind of feel to it.
Very cutting edge.
Yeah, like very much basically like now what you would buy when you go into
right.
Forever 21. And certainly their response was, yeah, that's not our brand. You know, our brand is basically a bad boy brand, right? Our brand is for blonde, thin people. None of you are that, so it's fine for us if you want to, you know, not shop at our store. I mean, how we were able to get the meeting, though, with them, I think really does touch at what we're talking about, because maybe it was the beginnings. Because what happened was, instead of just, you know, today we're talking about, you know, how do we use our money, right, around our politics, too. And some of that is what do you buy, but it can also be what do you not buy, right? Mm-hmm. And so what the girls were doing was we were basically sending emails to other teenagers and saying, "Don't shop at Abercrombie & Fitch," and tell everybody you know not to. And send an email to their investor relations department saying, "We're your biggest shareholders. We're your customers, and we're not going to shop at your store." And that's why it's the only boycott, you know, we call it the girl cot, but it's the only corporate boycott that ever happened to Abercrombie where they actually gave in to the demands and met with the people who staged it. And I think that's because it was teenagers. You know, it wasn't a church group. It wasn't somebody's parents. It was a group of teenagers. And, you know, Brooke was talking about when we were on the Today Show and they saw, you know, a girl with purple hair and another, you know, like cool-looking teenagers saying on national television to other teenagers, "Don't shop at Abercrombie." Right. That really got their attention. And so while Abercrombie were not visionaries to understand that the girls really were pitching to them a pretty good idea in 2005, I think that seed, what the girls were talking about was right. And they really were visionaries, which was, you will actually make more money if you sell girls T-shirts that make us feel good, rather than making us feel like crap, right? You will actually make better money if you sell us things that make us feel like we can empower one another with what's on our T-shirt instead of degrading one another. And so, you know, I mean, I feel, it's not to say that, if Ivanka Trump wore a T-shirt that said, I love smashing patriarchy, that suddenly, we necessarily would give her the Feminist of the Year award. So there's lots of complicated things, right, about the commercialization of feminism. But I do think we have to accept some part of that as a win, right?
Right, and I think the entire topic we're talking about begs the question of capitalism in general, which isn't a popular question in the United States, right? But it's really profitable to be casually sexist. It's really profitable to be casually racist. And so in similar kinds of campaigns that we've engaged in, I think the conversations at the table they risk being superficial, particularly when people think they're dealing with girls and teenage girls. And so the question is, how do you play both sides of capitalism? Because I'm trying to think of a good example. Because in this environment, a lot of what passes for girls' empowerment is profoundly racist over and over and over again. And so as young women, as older women, we need to be constantly vigilant to how those narratives of female empowerment play into those systems that undermine everybody. In the case of, we did something that was not dissimilar from that in 2013. I was part of a group, three of us organized a campaign challenging Facebook because Facebook was profusely filled with images of rape jokes, domestic violence, pictures of women being beaten, and the way the company more or less dealt with that was to slap on a little parenthetical that said controversial humor. And humor. And people had been talking about this for a really long time, and nothing was happening because it passes as humor. It really does, and all of us as women are exposed to astounding levels of images of objectification and violence. So we tried working very closely with Facebook for 8 or 9 months, and it yielded nothing. So we took a very similar approach, and we led a global boycott that threatened tens of millions of dollars within 2 days, and we started a conversation. Now, I think initially the conversation that they thought we might be having was take down the awful images, which of course they can't do because those images are the product of the world we live in. They could take down 10 million of them and 10 million more would fill them. So in a very superficial way, we were saying you need a better way of managing what this looks like to your users who are women and girls. But what we really needed them to do was diversify their own corporation. And that's a much different conversation. When you walk into the room and you say, hey, you know what? 93% of your engineers are men, and all of your women are in jobs where you clean up after those men, customer service, privacy, data. That's a problem with sex segregation in the industry and with certain levels of sexism and implicit sexism or implicit racism in the corporation. That's where the girl power t-shirts need to go. So if somebody produces a girl power t-shirt, I would like to know where it's being made. I would like to know who's profiting from the t-shirt. Those are the questions that have to come out of the t-shirts.
So now I have like 10 follow-up questions, but one, so both of you have been involved in very successful boycotts, girlcotts, whatever you want to call them. It can often feel powerless to just be an individual upset about the messages that a lot of these brands send. So when you were going about this with Facebook, what did you actually do? Like, how could the people in this room who are upset about a brand actually take action?
So the first thing I would say to you is you have a lot more power than you may feel as though you have. The second thing is very few things happen organically. You need to be strategic. You need to think exactly about what your objectives are, who your audience is, who the people that you will inflict pain on, because that's really what you're talking about. Very few people who are making a lot of money change their behavior unless their compensation structure is affected. And so you need to really sit down and think strategically about what you want to do and who has the decision-making power to do that thing. But I will say that while a lot of adults bash social media, I frankly think social media is the best thing that has ever happened for the ability of girls and women around the world to engage in public life and civic life. For decades, for centuries, for millennia actually, a girl alone could be kept in her house, in her room. There's still huge parts of the world where that is true, and that is largely not true anymore. The disembodiment that is part of the kinds of relationships we can build now mean that girls all over can feel less isolated. And I'm not just talking about girls in Pakistan, in a village somewhere. I'm talking about girls in Nashville. I've spoken all over the world where girls come up to me all over the country and they say things like, if I mention feminism at the dinner table, I am sent to my room. Or I've had girls who actually say, I don't have dinner that night. And so they may not have dinner that night, and they may not have a community in their place of worship or in their school, but they can actually find spaces online where they can build that kind of community. So I would just say don't underestimate yourself, but also don't underestimate the planning that you need to do to be really effective.
Any other tips? Should we come up with a campaign we want to start in this room today?
Well,
Does anyone have any suggestions?
Yeah, I completely agree about social media, though. I mean, it's such an incredible tool. I think, when we did the Girl Cut, it was at the very beginning. I mean, really, the only
so
tool.
2005.
Like,
were you
literally,
tweeting?
the only tool
what
was
were you doing?
no. There was no Twitter. There was not even Facebook. I think MySpace had just ended. That's where we were. I mean, it really was just email. And so, fast forward 10 years, and it is incredible, right? Certainly with Twitter and a million other things where globally you can launch a global movement, right? We could do it right here, right now. And I agree, you want to be strategic and thoughtful, but the tools are so powerful, and what makes them powerful is that they can unite girls and allies of girls around the world. And then together, you're so much more powerful than that idiot guy in an Abercrombie corporate,
in the
and that guy went down, and it really was eventually social media and the internet and popular opinion that and we see that with Uber's CEO, and I think, the tide is changing.
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of collective action happening. And I've been thinking about this in various contexts, but even you mentioned Uber, what we're seeing in Silicon Valley, which is all of these women standing up and speaking publicly for the first time about sexual harassment that they've experienced. But what's different about it now is that they have an army of women behind them. And whether it's women amplifying them on social media or physically standing with them, I think that's different from even 10 years ago. One quick follow-up. So were you guys actually picketing outside the Abercrombie offices? I'm how does one protest in 2005 with no social media?
We got stone and chisel. Yeah. Pigeons were delivering messages. But so what's interesting about it, you asked about, did it start with a protest? Mm-hmm. So where it started was this idea of having a protest outside of the mall, right? And sort of like body barricading other teenagers from coming into the mall. And then, good activists, it actually was a great lesson because guess what malls are? Private property. So you need to get a permit to have a protest. You can't get it. It's private property, right? And so then it was, okay, well, let's have a press conference. Okay, let's just start emailing everyone we know, right? And then it was, and I think this is where it got really strategic. Let's not just email everyone we know and say stop shopping, and let's not just randomly email to Abercrombie's info@ email that we're going to do this. Let's really target the investor relations department. And I think that's where it got smart, right? And so that's where it's who is your message to, right? And I think if we had sent those emails to the marketing department or the diversity and inclusion area, we probably would not have gotten the same response.
So, like, don't be afraid to go straight to the top, even if you're a teenage girl.
And in a capitalist world, which we live in, really thinking about, like, okay, so if it is about capitalism, like, where's their weakness? It's like the Death Star, right? Where's their weakness? And for a lot of these structures, it is around, their money.
Right.
So there's all these new words for the type of advertising we see now that's focused on empowerment. So it's like fempowerment, femvertising. What are other ones? I was making a list earlier. Anyway, like all of these combinations of words. And we truly see this everywhere. Like the broiest brands you can think of are like suddenly trying to capitalize on empowerment, whatever that may mean, in order to sell things. And the reason, in part, is because it's really effective. Like, I was reading some studies about this, and there was a Google Consumer Report survey that found that people 18 to 34 are much more likely, twice as likely, to support brands that showcase female empowerment. Again, whatever that may mean. So I think this plays out in different ways. Sometimes it feels really hollow. Raise your hand if you've heard of Fearless Girl, the statue on Wall Street. So has anyone taken a selfie with it? So great. Like, that statue made me feel really empowered, for lack of a better word. It's next to this very masculine bull. It represents something that is very different from what Wall Street has traditionally represented. Great. Okay, but surprise, the company behind it actually has barely any women in power. Right. So, like, it made us all feel good, but is it actually creating change? And another example, a couple of years back, there was this ad that went viral, and it was about saying sorry. It was about how women apologize. Have people seen this? It was for Pantene, and it was all about how women apologize more. And when you're in a work environment, if you're constantly apologizing before you speak, people aren't going to take you seriously. Like, okay, great, fair point. And then at the end, it was like, hashtag sorry not sorry, Pantene. And you're like, oh, so like just buy shampoo and then I'm gonna be empowered. Like, what? So, right. So my question is, can these types of things ever be good? Like, does the empowerment that we may feel, does the fact that I notice when I now apologize before I speak, actually outweigh the reality of, like, this corporation making money off of, like, my feminism? And this is complicated.
So I'm pretty cynical and power hungry, I think, right? And so I love feminist T-shirts. I think they're great, right? Like,
who here owns a T-shirt, a laptop case, an iPhone case, feminist as fuck, feminist, right? Nasty woman, nevertheless she persisted, pussy right? Grabs back, what if I forget it?
Like, well, this summer, I was going to wear it, but I thought it's too young a crowd, but it was what wine goes with smashing patriarchy.
Right.
Right? So, A, I love all of those things. But B, I really love eating, and I love buying clothes that I like, and I like at least trying, when I do those things, not to engage in a way that is possibly hurting other people, okay? So that's all really complicated, and I'm really tired all the time. And that has nothing to do...
It's exhausting.
Like, it's just it is exhausting to try and keep all of those things in the right place. But the problem I have with the word empowering is that it's not the same as power. And for us to change the world and make it a safer, healthier, cleaner place, we need actual power. And so sometimes I'm really happy because I put nail polish on. That makes me feel really kind of nice that day. But that's not power. And so I really strive when I'm wearing the T-shirt or putting the sticker on my computer to keep in mind that that has a specific place and that it's not everything. And in point of fact, it's frosting. It's really, I love frosting, I love cupcakes. I am not bashing frosting. But the cake is really important, and the ingredients that go in the cake are really important.
I love, so it's frosting feminism.
It's frosting
and we need to
feminism,
be like cake
right?
feminists.
Right. But you know, I want to
Have your cake and eat it,
I want to give
too.
you an example. Yeah, have your cake.
Just going to keep bringing the puns.
That's right. When we did our campaign, we took people were sending us literally hundreds of traumatizing, horribly violent images and asking, why are these here? There are guidelines. These guidelines say there's, no depictions of graphic violence, racist, misogynistic content, but there they were, and it just didn't count, it seemed. It was as though the images of women didn't count as racist or violent because they were entertaining. And that wasn't Facebook's fault per se. It was just that in the mainstream culture we live in, we produce a lot of this imagery and it becomes normalized. So we took these images as screen grabs, but right with the sponsoring advertiser image. And so Dove, for example, had an ad right next to a picture depicting domestic violence. And Dove has a brand, and Dove's brand is very much about female empowerment. Now that kind of depends on where you are, because in India, Dove's #1 selling product is a skin bleaching product, right? So that people can be whiter. And so this is an enormously complex problem that we have to deal with. There are no superficial solutions. Like a feminist t-shirt for every human being on the planet will never solve that problem, right? And so I would just say keep it in its place and divert your energies into the deeper problems if it's important to you.
And they can be entries too, right? Like, so I mentioned the Smashing Patriarchy t-shirt. We talked about like how feminism has changed. When I was in college, if I wore a t-shirt that talked about patriarchy, people would A, not know what that means, right? B, not be like high-fiving me at the grocery store. So I completely agree with everything that's been said around, especially like, okay, but before you buy the t-shirt, why don't you look into who makes the t-shirt and what the working, all of these things. And yet also, I think, someone talked about like, these things being sort of like a gateway drug to perhaps something better. Mm-hmm. And where I think they are relevant is around shifting the conversation, right? Yeah. And so in the way that like Dove is not at all a perfect company, but when they started to see, yes, right, that their brand was next to these images, they then, the advertisers, are actually, right, then they started to complain to Facebook and say, we can't have this, and that's where you started to see change happen. And right, even our dear Ivanka, so our organization, I know, right? Women and Girls Foundation is working to pass paid family leave in Pennsylvania. Right. And, we have a different idea of it than she does. But what's interesting is now something that used to be only talked about by one party is being talked about by two. We might have very different ideas of what it is, but what is interesting is by her talking about it, it actually is making it easier for us to get Republican legislators in our state to talk with us about paid leave when they never would before.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right. So I think it's like, what do you do with it? Right? Like, if you buy the t-shirt, that's nice, now what?
Now what?
I want to read, so Amina could not be here with us today, but she wrote this great piece for Racked about basically t-shirt feminism. So I just want to read a section real quick. She writes, shopping is shopping and political action is political action. And it's very hard to blend the two in a sincere way that actually results in the kind of political change we so desperately need. Knitting pink hats is great and very therapeutic, and I so desperately wish I could knit. But how exactly is that going to help when the administration starts jailing Muslims or taking away more of our civil rights? Can I trust that someone wearing a woke, the future is female sweatshirt will speak about injustice when someone is being harassed in front of them? Don't let all this candy marketing distract you from the fact that wearing high-waisted underwear is not, in fact, liberation work. So I just thought that put it so succinctly, which is that, yes, I love a feminist t-shirt. Like, don't get me wrong. But my feminism also needs to have some political action associated with it.
Yeah. Can I say one thing about that I think is important? Because I think that people think sexism and resistance to feminism I think they think resistance to feminism might be declining slowly over time, which is bullshit. right? So when you wear a t-shirt, that might itself be a very political act in your environment and in your stage of life. I don't want to suggest that is not true, because sometimes wearing the t-shirt is a very specific and very confrontational thing to do. And that is really important, because the main problem we have as feminists is the incompatibility of anger with being women. And specifically because anger usually is a response to an injustice, a feeling of wrongness. If you're a woman and you are angry on your own behalf, that is the worst thing you can do. You can be angry for other people. You can be mainly angry as a nurturer. Your anger finds its greatest fulfillment when you are angry for someone else. I'm angry for my children. I'm angry for my spouse. I'm angry for my classmates. The minute you start saying, time out, I am angry because I am being dealt an injustice, then that's when people shut you down. And so being aware of that and wearing the t-shirt, actually you're saying, it may not come out of your mouth, you're saying, I'm angry about this thing. And that is a very political thing to do.
And that's where activism happens, too, because then I think it becomes, what made you put that t-shirt on? Mm-hmm. So can your activism not end with the t-shirt, but begin with it, right? So, okay, you got the t-shirt. What was it that made you buy the t-shirt? And when you wear it, what is the thing that you want to change in the world? You know, and that's where the feminism goes, and that's where activism goes.
I love that. Soraya, you touched on something a moment ago, the idea that it can be exhausting. So, you know, like, here we are, we're all having this conversation about, like, every time we need to buy a t-shirt, we need to, like, know where it's made, and who's making it, and how it's manufactured, and, like, are they donating back to a feminist cause? And, like, this probably isn't happening in rooms full of men.
No.
Like, they're like, I'm gonna go fucking make money and not, like, worry about where my t-shirts are made. So to be a good feminist, quote unquote, can be exhausting at times. I have this coaster that sits on my desk that someone gave me that says, I should be rich as fuck right now. I'm sorry for all the F-bombs that I'm dropping. And I always joke, so I wrote this book called Feminist Fight Club, but I'm in a real-life feminist fight club. We fight patriarchy, not each other, and it's this group that I've been meeting with since I began my career about a decade ago. And we always joke in this group that, like, really we should be rich by now because we have all these great ideas. But as good feminists, it's like we give them away. We give away the ideas, we donate them.
Share them.
We get, like, some tiny little slice of income, and then we, like, donate that or divide it amongst the, like, 13 other people that had, like, some minute contribution to what we were doing. And this was an interesting thing that happened to me right before the election, because Pussy Grabs Back was a meme that I and a friend came up with. And we had no idea that it would go completely viral. We basically were, like, bored on a Saturday night, like, home alone. And everyone wanted it on t-shirts. So we were like, all right, gotta give the people what they want, put it on t-shirts. And so we worked with a woman of color in LA who has a t-shirt company, and she put them on t-shirts, and then we decided to donate a portion of proceeds to RAIN, the largest sexual violence organization. And then we divided it between the three of us, but then we also divided it between the woman who had inspired the meme with a cat image. And, like, by the time it was all said and done, like, this is for a good cause, it was fine, but, like, we weren't making any money.
You were spending money.
Yes, basically. And there was a lot of anger on the internet that was like, you shouldn't be profiting on this, like, you... And so it can be hard at times, like, so how do you be a good feminist? And so I guess what I'm trying to say here is, like, I like money, too. And I think that's okay. And in fact, money is power. Like, we know in this country that women make a fraction of what men do. Women of color make so much less. And so it's okay to like money. But how do you be a feminist and a capitalist? Is that possible?
While I know you're thinking of a very good answer, so I'm looking forward to that. It's cooking up right now. But this isn't an exact answer, but it really is what was going through my head as part of what as you were saying that, which is, you know, sometimes I think we're really also very hard on ourselves and one another. And all this talk of who's a feminist and who's allowed to be a feminist and who's a good enough feminist and who can call themselves a feminist. So sometimes it makes me think about, so I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood. I'm not very practicing anymore, but I did. And there were all these conversations, like people would get like, well, who's really Jewish and who's a Jew? And like, you're not married to a Jewish person, so are you Jewish? And like, you know, the people over there aren't very religious and we are, and we're more religious than they are. Guess what? Hitler had no problem figuring out who was Jewish. You know, people, when you walk into a room, if you're a person of color, no one has a problem figuring that out. So I think that the things that make us other, others don't have a problem figuring it out. And this is where my head sometimes goes in these conversations around. One can talk, and it's true, around different, you know, like, we can always be better, right? In the way that we can always be human. So like, don't talk to me, you know, like, okay, you're a feminist, great. Is your feminism intersectional? Is it monetary, right? There's lots of different ways and important places to go with it. But I also think that maybe we need to just also create space for people to walk in the door without having to have a checklist before they even walk into the door.
Right.
You know?
Purity tests.
Yeah, so that there's some space to say, oh, okay, so you're interested in this, and now what?
Right. And I think, too, it's important, like, we're all publicly feminists. We never stop talking, right? And that means we're always sort of in the crosshairs for something, because we're also human and we make mistakes, and even if we try really hard, we're making mistakes.
Right.
And that's hard in a world where, you're supposed to be perfect, or as close to perfect as possible, and you're also supposed to always put others first and be super nice, and smile, by the way, right? So I think that what I try and remember when I'm especially writing or speaking is that ideas have life cycles, and people come to them at different stages of their life cycles. And there are people who are early adopters for certain ideas and they push the envelope, and there are then people who are translators of those ideas because they have a different way of thinking or a language, and then there are the people who massage those ideas into mainstream acceptance. And it helps if you think, which person am I? Am I the person who has gotten that idea and actually it hasn't crossed the bridge yet into the mainstream? If I'm that person, what language am I using, or who am I talking to? If I'm the translator, what am I doing? Because those languages will be different, and the audience that you need to convince is going to be different. And nobody can do that whole life cycle, all of it at once, at all times. That is completely impossible. But it helps if you forgive yourself enough to say, this is what I have to do today. Like, this is where I think we are today in this space. I might switch tomorrow, the way all of our identities switch, and tomorrow I'm going to have to do something else in a different space.
We want to open it up to questions. So there are 2 mics. You're all old pros by now, but there are 2 mics. Please line up and ask anything. Let's start on this side.
Okay, hi, my name's Lily. I've been up here a couple times before. But anyways, so I just, talking about the t-shirts the entire time, I have a t-shirt that says, girls just want to have fundamental human rights. And so the first time I wore that shirt, I got, a couple claps and like, hey, that's a nice shirt, and also some weird looks on the train. But I think there was also a time in my school where we had a dress code protest just because a girl can't show her shoulders in school because it's distracting for a boy. And there's also that viral image saying, sending a girl home just because her bra straps are visible, or teaching her that boys' education are more important. So in that, I just wanted to ask you if there's a way that you think that we can fight the double standard that is saying that a boy can wear a muscle tank and baggy shorts, but a girl can't wear a tank top.
I mean, I think protesting it is exactly right. Like not every protest has to be the size of the Women's March. You can have small actions in your schools or in your environments that really do send a message. When I was in 7th grade, this was like my young budding activism, boys were not allowed to wear skirts. And that was not in any dress code, but a guy came to school wearing a skirt and he got suspended. And so we staged a walkout, and the local newspaper covered it. And I think that they ended up changing the dress code, or they took away his suspension. Anyway, these things, I think that what Soraya was saying earlier, you have more power than you think. And so I think continuing to call it out and
Right.
continuing to protest, even if it's in a small form.
So this is a topic that I'm 50 and still infuriates me, like few other things can, because it speaks so clearly to so many deeper problems. And so I have been really heartened to see these confrontations in schools, because administrators and parents do not really understand the degree to which their ideas about obscenity or appropriateness or traditions or proper behavior or appropriate behavior, how incredibly gendered they are. And so I always try and support those and applaud those. But I'm going to give you a different example of something that Jessica said earlier, which is that there is a much bigger support system now than I think existed before, which is incredibly valuable. So at Facebook, there was a group of people at one point that just called me the nipple lady. Because 4 years ago, when we started confronting them, there were really no allowable images of women's nipples, which is absurd, right? Like, women's nipples are not surprising to more than 50% of the population, as far as I know.
Also feed a lot of people.
Right? So it has been a very systematic approach to saying that is hurting us because of these double standards. We are not inherently sexually tempting to men. We're not distracting, all of those arguments. And so the first thing that they did was say, okay, we're going to allow post-mastectomy photographs. And then we kept pushing. And the second thing that they did was say, all right, we're going to allow pictures of breastfeeding women. The funniest thing I think I have heard among the many funny things that I hear as a feminist is that breastfeeding is not family friendly. Like, if that makes any sense to anyone, I would like them to explain it to me, right? So now if a woman happens to share a breastfeeding photo and her nipple shows, nobody will die, and everyone will be okay if it's on Facebook. But there are two other categories. One is art, right? Like if a woman paints a portrait of a nude woman, if Lucian Freud's painting can be posted in Facebook, why can't hers? And the second is political speech. Women artists and political activists use their naked bodies all the time because our nakedness and our embodiment is so tied to violence against us and our oppression. So you might not hear about 7,000 women protesting outside a cathedral in Colombia topless. You will not hear about 3,000 women protesting topless in Nigeria against Exxon. You will not see those images, and that is a suppression of their political speech. So it has to kind of happen at all levels, at all of our ages, right? You're gonna have to take that on in school. We have to take it on in our workplaces. So
Go to the school board.
Well, the school board is the problem, usually.
Right. But they are, right. But I mean, but really, I think I mentioned the school board because I think sometimes we think, oh, it's this
The
guidance
teacher,
counselor, it's the
right.
principal, and so often there's someone even higher than that. It sort of is the go to the top, the investor
Right.
relations. And students are incredibly, when you do engage in student organizing, school boards will respond.
No, I just want to say it actually started with the principal saying that, like, if we showed up violating the dress code, she'd make us wear an oversized T-shirt to make us, quote, look like a sack of potatoes.
Right.
Just, thank you.
Hi, so I'm Trinity Shaw, and my name is Barka Talat. We're from McMaster University in Canada. This was a really interesting session, so thank you for that. We were just wondering, while it's really important that T-shirts and branding of feminism is really popular now, the issue also rises of fast fashion and what other issues that brings in, like sweatshops, like Forever 21, Zara, H&M, all that kind of stuff. How do you deal with where you purchase your shirts from, and how do you support that or address those issues? And I know with that as well, classism comes in because these shirts are relatively more affordable and cheaper, like $5, $12, and better made shirts where people are treated better in these factories, they're much more expensive, and some people can't afford that. Like I myself, I work at H&M, and I remember in my orientation, like they were trying to explain this, and I was like, no, like I hate this, but I can't work anywhere else. So I just shut my mouth even when customers ask me, and I'm like, you can listen to my manager, I don't want to lie to you, like, you know, they can do all of that. But we were just wondering, how do you guys deal with that?
And furthermore, the fact is that when you try to find T-shirts that are sold by, you know, brands that don't use unethical measures to make their clothing, they're either really unaffordable, and it can also be that they're just following a trend, which is the case for pretty much all of the merchants out there. They're following a trend, a marketing trend, that to bring in most of the female consumers. So how do we deal with this ethical dilemma?
Well, I mean, I think this is a major problem for all of us, right? And the question is, and this is why I said probably we need to talk about capitalism itself, because why should it feel wrong to make money doing something you love that you think is good? That, like, are you okay with being rewarded? Are you okay being rewarded for your efforts? You've made this meme, it's turned into a product. Why should you feel better if you make less? That's kind of perverse, right? And so I think that it's very personal. You know, I mean, we are all thriving, relatively speaking, in the world in a capitalist system, right? There are no moneyless utopias that I'm aware of, right?
And you can make, I mean, you know, we all talked about it, right? It can be increasingly complicated to try to find, right, the origins of that T-shirt, right? Like, where did this come from? Who created it? What company? You know, one thing if you can do, right, is also make your own, right? You know, find a woman-owned company that has an organic T-shirt, right, and then just put your own message right on top of it. You know, and I think that's one of the things that's interesting online, is you see also independent creators have more immediate access to others, right? But I think, you know, so much of all of it is so complicated. Where we buy our food, how the food's created, right? All of these things, and you just have to sort of try and do your best.
Yeah, exactly. I think you have to do your best. Like, do I own things from H&M and Forever 21? Yes.
Yes.
Do I try to go to some of the independent female designers when I can afford it? Yes. But, like, do I want to spend all day thinking about this? No, because then I won't do work and I won't make money, and then here we are, like, capitalism again. But I think, like, nobody's perfect, and women are often harder on themselves.
Right.
So, like, you do what you can do, and if there's a time when H&M's like selling some girl power T-shirt, and you're like, oh, there's this cool independent designer that actually sells this, like, maybe that's your little sly action that you're taking. Unfortunately, I've been told we are out of time, but thank you all so much, and we'll be around if you want to ask questions after.
Thank you.